front bench and then the Minister.
Thanks, the Noble Lord. My Lord, this has been an interesting debate, rather long debate, on a very short amendment to a short bill. And I appreciate, though, the amendment itself talks about a ratification referendum. In the Noble Lord Newby's opening comments, he spoke about people changing their minds amid this very much an issue about people being able to change their minds. But it's been a much broader discussion than just this particular amendment. I have to say, my Lords, that as somebody who campaigned strongly for Remain and remains bitterly disappointed at the results, I agree with many of the comments that have been made in the debate, but I'm not sure they actually bring much to bear on whether or not a second referendum is appropriate at this time, because the demands for a second referendum started even before the ink was dry on the ballot papers of the first referendum. We know it's rare for us to have a national referendum. In 1975, the incredible Labour Party leader and Prime Minister Harold Wilson held a referendum on whether or not we should remain in the European Community or we should leave. And I think, my Lords, I'm in a minority in your Lordship's House, but not alone in that I wasn't able to vote in that referendum, being far too young. I think the Noble Lord the Minister couldn't vote in that referendum either. But in 2011, we had the referendum from coalition government on whether to change the voting system, in which Parliament, by legislation, ceded sovereignty to the public on that referendum. And then in 2016, last year, we had the EU referendum. And I think on the EU, there's clearly public interest. Both had high turnouts. It's a bit lower in 1975, but I don't think anybody really thought we were going to leave. And the margin of difference in favour of retaining EU membership, Noble Lord Morgan reminded us, was significant at 33%. But last year, with the polls so close, that probably encouraged that high turnout of 72%. And yet the referendum on changing the voting system motivated fewer than half of our fellow citizens, just 42%. And there was never any real public demand for such a change, and to most people it appeared to be very politician-led. So when we debated this amendment in committee, I expressed my natural caution about politicians calling for a referendum on any issue. And it's usually because we think it will endorse the result that we want. And I accept with some exceptions today, some Noble Lords have made a case for direct or popular democracy, but the Noble Lord Newby made it clear what his reasons were for bringing this forward. And I think there is clearly a difference between a public demand for referendum, as we've seen, but again, politicians, I think, have to take care in how we respond to that public demand. I listened carefully to Noble Lord Newby as he opened this debate, and others, and I read his article in the House magazine on this issue, in which he was totally honest about his amendment for further referendum. And despite the comments from a number in your Lordship's House, this is merely about giving the public a say on the exit arrangements, he was very clear, because he took the views he thinks the public will change their mind. In his House magazine, he said, "It is implausible not to grant a second referendum if public opinion shifts in favour of the EU." But, my Lords, there's no significant public demand for a second referendum, and at this stage, there's no significant shift in public opinion. And it is being seen by many as merely a campaign to challenge the result of the first. And that was reinforced last week when the Noble Lord spoke about the purpose behind his amendment. But, my Lord, that's exactly the point. A second referendum wouldn't be on the deal or the arrangements, but yet again on a principle, or rather a mood, how people felt about the EU at the last time. Before the last referendum, indeed before the last elections, the Noble Lord and Liberal Democrats campaigned for what they called a real referendum, and that is an in-out referendum on principle, and they criticised both my party, the Labour Party, and they criticised the Conservatives for not going far enough in agreeing with them. And I have a copy of that leaflet with me today. And it has a petition, sign our petition today from the Liberal Democrats. It's time for a real referendum on Europe. But nowhere, my lords, on this leaflet calling for this real referendum does it say, but if you don't agree with us, we'll try and have another one. And my understanding from those who were there at the time is that they considered, I think this is absolutely crucial to this, they considered that although their policy was to have a referendum limited to the Lisbon Treaty, their campaign literature didn't, because they felt that that would not be clearly understood, and any referendum would inevitably turn into, do you like the EU or not? And my lords, I think that's right, because that's what we saw last year. And it's also why the Noble Lord Newby's confidence in having a referendum to show that people have changed their minds is flawed, because after 2 years of what could be very difficult negotiations, it could well become a referendum, in effect, of whether we like or are happy with our European neighbours. The coming months of negotiations are going to be complex. We're pressing the government on ensuring that Parliament is kept fully engaged and fully informed throughout the process, and has an opportunity for final say and meaningful vote on the exit arrangements or deal. And Parliament is going to have to make a judgment on that. And MPs, members of the other place, are accountable to their constituents, which is why the final say, the responsibility and the authority must always remain with the House of Commons. That is what parliamentary sovereignty means. It means taking responsibility. And it also means, my lords, that the government must keep Parliament involved and informed, using the committees of Parliament, particularly your Lordship's House, for support and for advice, and ensuring that as we move closer towards closing the deal, a judgment can be made in an informed, factual way. And I find it hard, having gone through that first referendum, to see circumstances in which a second referendum, when the press, the politicians, there'll be campaigns out there campaigning on this issue, can deal with all the detail required, with all the information that's been gained over 2 years, and not just be a referendum on principle, in effect running the first referendum. And that final judgment, my lords, has to be a very measured judgment, dealing with the forensic detail, not an appeal to the emotions without hard, accurate facts, not to see vehicles running around the country saying you get £350 million extra for the NHS if you vote to leave the EU. The first referendum was one on which different sides campaigned and lobbied around the principle of staying in or leaving. And I'm on record as saying I was unimpressed with the campaigning. I've not yet been convinced that that approach works. And I made a plea when we were dealing with this issue prior to the referendum that it should have been for Parliament as a whole to provide factual, accurate information to the public and not leave it to campaigns to see who could shout the loudest for the longest. So I'm not convinced that approach works when we're dealing with the detail of negotiations that have taken place over the last 2 years, any more than it worked in the last referendum. And my lords, as we've heard today, it's quite clear that a second referendum is being pushed by some as a way to unite a seriously divided country on this issue. And I've looked to see where the evidence is to support that. Why would a second referendum be different in tone, in mood and in arguments to a first? And I take comfort from the words of the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in what I thought was a very thoughtful and wise intervention in the debate. He made it clear that come a referendum, whether it's a first referendum, as we saw, or a second referendum, or any other, it will be down to a binary choice. It will be yes or no, and that never unites, it only ever divides. My lords, the Noble Lord, I can hear the Noble Lord Lady Ludford chuntering away. Bear with me, please. My lords, the Noble Lord Newby was asked a question by the Noble Lord Beaucourt, and I remained puzzled by his answer, which I thought was unclear. Is the referendum, if this House chooses to recommend to the other place to have a second referendum, will it be advisory or binding? And we've heard from others that unless Parliament specifically says so, all referendums should be advisory. His party, unless there is in the legislation it says otherwise. But, my Lords, his party says they respect the result, but they voted against the second reading of the bill in the other place. What happens if a second referendum comes back and there are those in his party who don't like that second referendum result? I'm not sure if that takes us any further forward. And, my Lords, I think we need to go into a second referendum without that clarity, and to look at it today without such clarity, I think would not be democratic at all. It doesn't seem to me to be thought through. But, my Lords, I always say, as I said before, I don't think the government can shut the door completely on this issue or shut the door on public opinion. Throughout the process, the government has to take note of the public mood, it has to keep Parliament informed, and it has to keep the public informed. And it must not allow rumour and misinformation to circulate, and it must be honest. So I don't disagree with many of the comments that have been made today. I felt the last campaign really got down to the details that Parliament has discussed, both in your Lordship's House and in the other place, during this passage of this bill. And I think does Parliament credit, particularly I think our debate last week on EU nationals, of the detail that we were able to debate in this House that never got an airing during a referendum. So, my Lords, I say our priority is today Amendment 3, to ensure that Parliament has a meaningful vote, to ensure we maintain parliamentary sovereignty, but also other amendments to show that Parliament must be fully engaged in this process, and as usual, our members of Parliament accountable through their constituencies. So, my Lords, I can't support this amendment. I will ask my colleagues not to support this amendment, and we will not take part in this vote.
My Lords, this has been another good debate, and I suspect it's confirmed what many of us already know, namely that there are a number of your Lordships who passionately believe that the people have made a grave mistake by voting to leave the European Union, and that there needs to be a referendum at the end of the negotiations. Now, my Lords, as I've said before, I respect their views, and I repeat my wish to bring together those who are on both sides of the argument, leave and remain, as we continue. But the government is very clear that the amendment before us is misguided, both in practice and in principle. And our reasons for that are very clear, and they start with the democratic path that we have followed so far. On 7th of May 2015, the Conservative government was elected by 11.3 million people, committed to a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union, and committed to honouring the outcome. On the 7th of May 2015, 316 members of the other place voted in favour of holding a referendum, by a majority of 6 to 1. There was no condition or caveat attached to the referendum, as my noble friend Lord Fawkes pointed out. And Parliament, my Lords, agreed on the question. It was a simple question, leave or remain. And so, on the 23rd of June, 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union. And on the 8th of February this year, the other place passed this bill, unamended, a simple bill, to trigger the process of leaving the European Union by a majority of 372. This, my Lords, is the democratic path that has been followed, a path that will lead this country to leaving the European Union. And now some argue that we need another referendum on what I consider to be somewhat peculiar and weak arguments. However it is dressed up, it will be seen as a second referendum. I cannot support that. Our people have already spoken. The wise words of the noble Lord Lee of Trafford, and how right he is. And listen to Mr. Norman Lamb, the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for North Norfolk. He said that the second referendum would indeed, quotes, raise the question as to whether we'd remain in the European Union. But, my Lords, it was made abundantly clear that the referendum in June was, to quote the leaflet sent to all households in the UK, a once-in-a-generation decision. There was nothing on the ballot and no suggestion from Parliament that there would have to be another referendum if the UK were to vote to leave. The then Prime Minister said during the campaign, and I quote, "I am absolutely clear a referendum is a referendum. It's a once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and the result determines the outcome. You can't have never-endums, you have referendums." So, my lords, the next bogus argument is that people did not know enough to make an informed decision. I personally don't see that approach and that argument as either particularly liberal or democratic. I do, my lord, see it as somewhat patronising. It's as if we're saying we trust the people, but not quite entirely. My lords, that government leaflet spelt out the consequences, and on many occasions during the campaign, those on both sides of the argument made it clear that a vote to leave meant leaving the single market. For example, Mr. David Cameron, quote, "The British public would be voting if we leave to leave the EU and leave the single market." Mr. George Osborne, "We'd be out of the single market. That's the reality." Mr. Michael Gove, "We should be outside the single market." The noble Lord Darling, "Those wanting to leave the EU want to pull Britain out of the single market." My noble friend Lord Hill of Orford, "The Leave campaign has been clear what leave means. It means leaving the single market." And, my lords, these politicians were quite right to point this out. For if we were to remain in the single market, it would mean complying with the EU's rules and regulations without having a vote on what those rules and regulations are. It would mean accepting a role for the European Court of Justice that would still see it having direct legal authority in our country, and it would mean not having control of our borders. It would, my lords, to all intents and purposes, mean not leaving the EU at all. The next peculiar argument, is that a second referendum is needed to bring the nation together. And here I agree entirely with the words of the noble Baroness Smith. My lords, if the argument is that the first referendum divided the nation, a second referendum is hardly likely to unite it. In fact, quite the reverse. Rather than bring people together, it would merely encourage divisions to fester. And let me say a word here about the need to come together. And the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, made what was indeed a very thoughtful and powerful speech. And, my lords, the Archbishop is right about the need to heal our divisions and to work together to tackle the challenges we face. And I would like to put on the record once again my thanks to the Church of England for hosting roundtables to do just that. And, my lords, others agree that we need to come together. That, and I quote, "If we have to be out then, let's make the best of it." These are the words of the noble Lord Ashdown, who on the question of a second referendum said, "Politicians should stay out of that." And the report of this event at which he said this, which I assume to be valid and not some fake news, continues as follows. Lord Ashdown, quotes, "did not call for a second referendum on the UK's membership of the EU, saying it would be foolish and wrong for Parliament to do that." And then...
Let me see if I can make a rather better hash of it this time than I did in the noble Lord Carlisle. Is the Minister embarrassed by the fact that he keeps on answering the question by referring to an issue that is not addressed? We are not saying there has to be a second referendum on the European Union membership. That is done. The government has its mandate. We accept that. What we don't believe the government has a mandate for is a brutal Brexit that will take us out of the single market. And can he explain why he believes he does have that mandate, given that it was in the Conservative Party manifesto that they would specifically not do this?
Well, the Conservative Party manifesto is absolutely clear that we would respect the outcome, a position that the noble Lord himself took on the outcome on the night of the referendum, and it is absolutely our intent, my lords, for the government to deliver on the results of the referendum. I know that the noble Lord is spending his Lent eating his own words, but I'm sorry to say that he is wrong on this point. And then there are the consequences, my lords, of such a referendum. Would it bring certainty? Will businesses clap their hands with glee at the thought of referendum some years off, the basis of which would be unclear, and the consequences of which could be to throw the entire negotiated settlement up in the air? And, my lords, we know the answer. As I said, the Institute of Directors have called for a commitment across all political parties not to undertake a second referendum on either EU membership or the Brexit deal to reduce uncertainty. But, my lords, what would happen, even after all of this, if the result of the second referendum is still to leave? As some noble lords have pointed out, would we once again be subjected to people saying, actually, we don't like this answer, please try again? My lords, where does this end? Will we continue to hold the same referendum until we get the result that those who support this amendment prefer? The noble Lord...
If, as the Prime Minister said in her Lancaster House speech, that no deal would be better than a bad deal, is the Minister really, the Noble Lord the Minister, really telling us that in the circumstances of a no deal, he would absolutely rule out a referendum on the future?
Yes, my lords, it's very clear. We are leaving the European Union. That is the pure and simple answer to the Noble... No, I'm sorry, I'm going to finish, my lords. We will come back to this, I know, my lords, I'm not giving way. Forgive me, we're going to have a lot of debate after lunch, I know, about the meaningful vote that's going to be on. And so, my lords, I'm sure the Noble Lord will have a chance then to say this. My lords, would people... my lords, as the Noble Lord Newby said on Wednesday, that the rejection of a second referendum is the antithesis of democracy. Well, with respect to the Noble Lord, I totally and utterly disagree. The referendum itself was democracy in action. So, my lords, a second referendum entails risks for which the price is too high. A further vote will prolong the uncertainty and cause uproar in the country or worse. These are the words of the noble Baroness Faulkner of Malgravine and the noble Lord Lee of Trafford, and I entirely agree with them. To call a second referendum, as this amendment seeks to do, undermines the will of the people as expressed in the EU referendum. The people have voted to leave the European Union, and leave we will. So I hope the noble lords will withdraw their amendment.
My lords, can I thank all noble lords who've taken part in this debate, which boils down to a single question. Is it Parliament or is it the people that take the final decision on our future in Europe? My lords, the noble Lord Carlisle said that it should be Parliament, but that if Parliament rejected the deal, there might be a confidence vote. There would then be a general election. But, my lords, a general election is an extremely imperfect way to debate a single issue. I think, my lords, all parties have found this. I think Mr. Heath found that. The noble Lord Forsyth says that the Liberal Democrats might have found it. But with the current leadership of the two political parties, does he genuinely believe that a general election would be solely or even mainly on the issue of Brexit? No, my lords, a general election is a very, very imperfect tool for dealing with such a specific question. My lords, I have the highest regard for the Most Reverend Primate, but I'm afraid that when he says that a further referendum is not democratic, I simply cannot agree. I cannot see the logic, and I'm sorry to have to say it, but I really cannot follow that argument at all. My lords, it's been argued that the people can't take a decision in these circumstances because it would be a binary choice. It's quite unclear to me why it's perfectly reasonable for Parliament to take a binary choice, but not the people. And finally, my lords, it's been argued by a number of noble lords that it's actually all too complicated for the people to take a final choice and decision on this matter. My lords, this is the antithesis of democracy. I ended my second reading speech by quoting Gladstone and indeed the Brexit Secretary. Trust the people. My lords, that was our stance a fortnight ago. That's our stance today. I beg to test the opinion of the House.
The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. Contrary, not content. Not content. Clear the bar. question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. As many as that opinion will say content? Content. The contrary not content? Not content. The contents will go to the right by the throne, the not contents to the left by the bar. My Lords, there have voted contents 131, not contents 336. So the not contents have it.
In Clause 1, Amendment 2, Baroness Hayter.
I wonder, my Lords, whether it would help, noble Lords, if I just explained that we hope to complete this before we adjourn report stage for questions, and so that noble Lords might have some refreshment before we get to 2:30. So I apologise.
I've always thought the Government Chief Whip was a very nice man. I don't think he was offering us all lunch today, but he was offering us time for lunch today. My Lords, this is a short and very, I hope, sweet amendment, because what it is about, in a sense, is the cement between the Amendment 1 and Amendment 3. Amendment 1 has been defeated, and therefore we are not talking about a referendum at the end. But Amendment 3, which I trust is going to be carried, is about putting the decision at the end to Parliament. And therefore what Amendment 2 does is basically saying, in order to make that as good a way of moving forward as possible, we will need to have from the government, not as a running commentary, not even as a walking commentary, but as a dialogue with Parliament, some feedback about how the negotiations are going. And it isn't just about what we are offering as a government, as a country, but very much about what's happening on the other side. Because we think we will be negotiating just with one bloc in the European Union, but of course there are 27 on that side, and there will be ups and downs, elections, change of personnel, all sorts of things happening within those 27 countries. And the other issue is that, as Charles Grant, the CER, I think he usually is correct, has said, that in all of this, politics matters more than economics. So having some feedback from the government about how the other countries and how the European Union is responding, I think will help us understand the negotiations. Because the one thing, as I said in committee, that I think it would be terrible if we come to that final vote in this House and there are surprises. If we do not know how things have been happening, how the discussions have been going, and even more, if the government hasn't taken the time, particularly to listen to our EU committees, and so that there is a real feel about what the House and the other side.
Giving way at this point, what would be the provision possibly for an expression of opinion in both houses on the latest state of those quarterly reports and negotiations? If people did want to express an opinion, it might be legitimate for them to do so with a formal vote.
I will leave those up to the usual channels who always discuss these at the time. I deal with content, not process, which is why I'm very pleased when this bill will be over and we'll get into the real meat of the negotiations. And I have to say, I do wish the ministers luck in this. I think this task of negotiating is going to be extremely hard, but that is why I think they could benefit from discussions in the House. So I think the important thing of this is that we should hear back almost the mood music of what's going on. We should hear some detail, and it won't be any surprise. If people think this is all going to be secret, then they haven't worked in Brussels very long. It's as leaky as a sieve. And I think actually we're going to be reading about a lot of it, which I think it'll be more like a colander than a bucket where things are going on in there. And therefore the idea of taking stock on that is important. It will also be important, as we've already stressed, the importance of the devolved authorities being involved, to just check that they also are and that we can talk on this. So with a nod really to this afternoon's debate and what I hope will be the outcome of that, which is that Parliament will get the final vote, then I think if that final deal is to win the consent of Parliament, then there should be no surprises, that it should have been a very grown-up conversation that goes on. I'm sure that the government won't veer off in ways that would surprise us, because we don't want to be able to voting down something for that reason, because it's been a surprise. We want to be able to have a proper vote at that time. So, my Lords, this is really to say, in order to make the final vote a proper one, then we would ask for these quarterly. And if the Minister thinks it means only quarterly, I think he has to think again, but a minimum of quarterly reports so that we can discuss how it's going. I beg to move.
Opposed. Page 1, line 10. Insert the words printed on the marshaled list.
I rise very briefly to support the Noble Lady Baroness Hayter. I think it is important to have a structured schedule and framework for reporting back to Parliament as part of the whole scheme that we're trying to set up, including a meaningful vote that we'll be discussing this afternoon. The European Parliament example has been much prayed in aid, and those of us like myself who were in the European Parliament will know that, and others of course, will know that one of the incentives for making sure the European Parliament was kept informed throughout the process of negotiating external agreements was that they had the power to reject it at the end. And after the European Parliament had rejected several international agreements, finally the European Council and the Council of Ministers and the Commission came to their senses and thought, well, it's much better to front-load the system so that the European Parliament is kept informed along the way, instead of us, the Council, the Commission, getting a nasty surprise at the end. So that accounts for, in the jargon, the interinstitutional arrangements, which include reports and, of course, the making available of documents throughout the process. There's a much better way of managing it and making sure that the EU's, the Council's negotiating objectives are actually delivered in a smooth, orderly way, which I think is the phrase used by the government so often about Brexit. So there are good practical reasons for having a very structured report-back system.
My Lord, the Noble Lady Ludford talks about everything being in a smooth and orderly array. I rather agree with the Noble Lady Hayter. I think what's actually going to happen is that everything's going to leak. The EU Commission is actually under an obligation to report to the European Parliament. And the whole idea that the European Parliament will then say, this is all secret information, we shouldn't in any way let any of this out, seems to me to be for the birds. So everything will leak, and we will hear these rumours about how far the negotiations have got or what's happened. And at that point, Parliament will demand that there is a debate. And the government will get up, if this amendment is passed, and say, no, you must wait for the quarterly review, which is coming up in 2 months' time. I don't think so, my lords. I think that the House of Commons will say, come on, get on with it. We want a response. Why have we heard these rumours? And, the government has put us straight on all this. So I don't think this amendment achieves anything, to be quite honest, because I think everything that goes on in terms of negotiations will leak, and when things of substance leak, at that point Parliament will demand a debate, particularly the Commons, and we will no doubt do the same in your Lordship's House as well. So I think that this amendment is OTOs.
My Lords, I made the point at committee stage that if you want sovereignty of Parliament, then you should vote as quickly as possible for the bill, to get us out of for this bill and then subsequent bills, to get us out of the control of the European Union. I made that point. I make the point now, but it's rather similar to my noble friend's point, that it's highly unlikely that the government will accept this amendment, and that therefore we are into a potential constitutional issue. And if this motion prevails today, and therefore one has to ask the question: what are the options? What are the options that are likely to occur in the event of this House passing this amendment, and the other House, as my noble friend has just suggested, will pass it back to us, and the government will stay firm? I think there are three options. Government could do nothing and could concede the situation. I think that's highly unlikely. I think that to lose control of this bill at this stage on this issue would be very questionable wisdom on the part of the government. Secondly, it could create 100 peers. I think that is unlikely as well. It's rather dramatic at this stage, but I think unlikely. And thirdly, it could call a general election. And I think that is what the option would I think should be under strong consideration by the government at the moment. I personally think they should call a general election, a vote of confidence or whatever it is in the Commons, call a general election and have it out in the well-known democratic way of doing things, general election. So I personally think, and I want to put it on record, that I think we should call a general election in the event of coming to give it one round of ping-pong and then call a general election.
I wish to speak in support of this amendment. I had a similar amendment down in committee, which was actually rather less demanding than this particular amendment, and the government dispatched that extremely briskly. But I want to make a point, really, which would suggest that this amendment might actually be helpful to the government. Because the idea that all these special interest groups who are affected by these negotiations, the different sectors, the different companies, the different pressure groups, the idea that they're all going to sit still while stuff is coming out of the EU about possibilities for doing damage to their particular set of interests and concerns is fanciful. So if the Minister and the Government do not have any kind of structured way for reporting back to Parliament, I think what you're going to find is that many of these people are certainly going to lobby your Lordship's House. And there is going to be a demand for a huge number of parliamentary questions, demands for debates, to deal with the latest set of rumours about one particular sector, one particular industry, one particular agency which may be being transferred back to Europe. And the EMA would be a good example. Euratom, another good example. So that the government might find that their life is made a bit easier if there was a structured way of reporting back to Parliament about what progress was being made, and that it was reasonably detailed and was actually able to tell some of these interest groups what was actually going on in these negotiations.
Before the Lord sits down, do you think that the Parliament's going to be happy, though, if they're given the response that because the quarterly review is coming up and it's 2 months away, the question can't be answered today. It'll have to be answered in 2 months' time, which is when the next clock ticks round.
Well, the Baroness's amendment is actually very flexible. It says at least 3 months. It does nothing in this amendment to stop the government serving its own interests by being more forthcoming more frequently. I'm sure she wouldn't mind actually having reports which were made on a more frequent basis.
I'm sure that the government shares the sentiments expressed from the front bench opposite, indeed both front benches opposite, and that it is entirely in the interest of a smooth development of policy in this difficult area, which I'm sure we all understand is extremely difficult, and the most help they can get, the better. And I think that
the government is sufficiently humble to know that. And what I want to say is that we have in this Parliament plenty of means for getting the government, if there was any slackness on their part, to respond. But what I don't agree with is putting this into an Act of Parliament. And the reason for that is simple. If you have a thing in a general Act of Parliament, the idea is that the courts should be the enforcers. Well, the one thing the courts can't, or one of the things the courts can't do in view of the Bill of Rights, is to interfere in proceedings in Parliament. And therefore this is useless as a formal amendment, but the spirit of the amendment is first class. And I feel almost certain that my noble and learned friend will be able to accept that, because the Minister in the Commons has said just as much in a passage which I may be referring to later.
My Lords, I'm obliged for the contributions that have been made to the debate. This is a short bill which has already invoked many hours of debate, and I intend to keep my remarks very brief indeed. I endorse the observations of the noble and learned Lord Mackay of Clashfern, both as to the appropriateness of this amendment, but also as to the spirit in which it will be and is being received by the government. As noble lords will be aware, the Prime Minister gives a statement to the other place following European councils, and we know that there will be a council this month and indeed quarterly thereafter. That means that a statement will be made to Parliament at least once every quarter on European issues, and indeed such a statement will be repeated in this House. But of course, that's just the beginning of a much wider process over which this Parliament has control at the end of the day. Deputy Ministers have responded to over 600 parliamentary written questions, appeared at 13 select committees and given 6 oral statements to the House with regard to developments as regards our exit. The Secretary of State has agreed to give evidence to the exiting the EU Select Committee on 15th March alongside the Permanent Secretary at the Deputy Department, and it will shortly afterwards give evidence to the Lords EU Committee on the 22nd of March. So the Government is committed to parliamentary scrutiny, and Parliament will play a key role in scrutinising and shaping our withdrawal. And as my noble friend Lord Bridges observed last week, we've had take-note debates, debates on select committee reports, debates in government time, select committee appearances. All of this will continue in order that Parliament can scrutinise the development of negotiations insofar as it's possible to put those in the public domain and insofar as they come into the public domain. The noble Baroness Lady Hayter referred to secrets. The noble Baroness Lady Ludford referred to nasty secrets. This may reflect a difference of approach, but at the end of the day, there won't be a secret. You cannot conduct such a process in secret, ultimately, and you cannot then expect Parliament to consider that it has been kept properly informed as it should be if you do have what are termed secrets. We are committed to keeping Parliament at least as well informed as the European Parliament as negotiations progress. And a bill to repeal the European Communities Act will follow. There will be primary legislation on issues such as immigration and customs, and a vote at the end in regard to the process on the final deal to exit. So, my Lords, with all that in mind, can I just pose one or two questions? Is the Prime Minister already bound to give a statement to Parliament after every quarterly European Council? And the answer is yes. Has the Government been willing to give frequent statements to Parliament? And the answer is yes. Have Deputy Ministers and other Government Ministers appeared in front of select committees? The answer is yes. Has the Government listened to select committee reports? And the answer is yes. We published a white paper in February of this year. Does the Government aim to respond to the Select Committee reports about Brexit within 2 months? The answer is yes. Has the Government said it will give more information to Parliament as long as it does not undermine our negotiating position? And the answer is yes. And then there is the core question. What is the present bill about? This bill is about giving the Prime Minister the authority to give notice of withdrawal from the European Union. So, with great respect to the House and to all noble lords, let us proceed and pass this bill. It will not be improved by unnecessary decoration. And as the noble and learned Lord Mackay of Clashfern has already observed, it is not appropriate that this amendment should proceed. And as I believe all members of your Lordship's House who've spoken would perhaps acknowledge, it's not necessary that this amendment should proceed in these circumstances, and therefore I would invite noble lords to withdraw this amendment.
May I thank the noble Lord the Minister and indeed the other noble lords who've contributed, which I think is actually, the most helpful exchange, and no disrespect to the others, was to hear Lord Mackay support the spirit of it, and then the noble Lord the Minister saying, I agree. I think if I can just bottle that, that will do me nicely. I only want to make, I think, two other points. One is that, of course, although there are report backs after the EC, the European Council, for when the European Council discusses our departure, the UK won't be there, and therefore actually it's the other meetings we're interested in. And the only other comment I want to make is, I'm afraid, in response to the Lord Spicer, with the suggestion that if we dare to suggest that Parliament, rather than the Crown, should take the final decision, that Mrs May might call an election. Because I am much older than my noble friend who spoke earlier, and not only did I vote in 1975, but I remember the February 1974 election very, very well, when Edward Heath basically had an election on who governs Britain. And I think Mrs May would not be well advised to go to the country on do you want the government or Parliament to govern Britain? But that really is beside the point, and I thank very much the tone of the noble Lord the Minister's response, and on that basis I beg leave to withdraw the amendment.
It is your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn. The amendment is by leave withdrawn.
My Lords, I beg to move that further consideration on the report be now adjourned until after oral questions.
Question is that further consideration on the report be now adjourned until after oral questions. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn during pleasure until 2:30.
Question is that the House do now adjourn during pleasure until 2:30. As many as of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it.
The front bench and then the Minister.
Thanks, the noble Lord. My Lord, this has been an interesting debate, a long debate, on a very short amendment to a short bill. And I appreciate, though, the amendment itself talks about a ratification referendum. In the noble Lord Newby's opening comments, he spoke about people changing their minds and made this very much an issue about people being able to change their minds. But it's been a much broader discussion than just this particular amendment. I have to say, my Lords, that as somebody who campaigned strongly for Remain and remains bitterly disappointed at the results, I agree with many of the comments that have been made in the debate, but I'm not sure they actually bring much to bear on whether or not a second referendum is appropriate at this time, because the demands for a second referendum started even before the ink was dry on the ballot papers of the first referendum. We know it's rare for us to have a national referendum. In 1975, the incredible Labour Party leader and Prime Minister Harold Wilson held a referendum on whether or not we should remain in the European Community or we should leave. And I think, my Lords, I'm in a minority in your Lordship's House, but not alone, in that I wasn't able to vote in that referendum. Being far too young. I think the noble Lord the Minister couldn't vote in that referendum either. But in 2011, we had the referendum from coalition government on whether to change the voting system, in which Parliament, by legislation, ceded sovereignty to the public on that referendum. And then in 2016, last year, we had the EU referendum. And I think on the EU, there's clearly public interest. Both had high turnouts. It's a bit lower in 1975, but I don't think anybody really thought we were going to leave. And the margin of difference in favour of retaining EU membership, the noble Lord Morgan reminded us, was significant at 33%. But last year, the polls so close, that probably encouraged that high turnout of 72%. And yet the referendum on changing the voting system motivated fewer than half of our fellow citizens, just 42%. And there was never any real public demand for such a change, and to most people it appeared to be very politician-led. So when we debated this amendment in committee, I expressed my natural caution about politicians calling for a referendum on any issue. And it's usually because we think it will endorse the result that we want. And I accept some exceptions today. Some noble lords have made a case for direct or popular democracy, but the noble Lord Newby made it clear what his reasons were for bringing this forward. And I think there is clearly a difference between a public demand for referendum, as we've seen, but again, politicians, I think, have to take care in how we respond to that public demand. I listened carefully to noble Lord Newby as he opened this debate, and others, and I read his article in the House magazine on this issue, in which he was totally honest about his amendment for further referendum. And despite the comments from a number of your Lordship's House, this is merely about giving the public a say on the exit arrangements, he was very clear, because he took the views he thinks the public will change their mind. In his House magazine, he said, "It is implausible not to grant a second referendum if public opinion shifts in favour of the EU." But, my Lords, there's no significant public demand for a second referendum, and at this stage, there's no significant shift in public opinion. And it is being seen by many as merely a campaign to challenge the result of the first. And that was reinforced last week when the noble Lord spoke about the purpose behind his amendment. But, my Lord, that's exactly the point. A second referendum wouldn't be on the deal or the arrangements, but yet again on a principle, or rather a mood, how people felt about the EU at the last time. Before the last referendum, indeed before the last elections, the noble Lord and Liberal Democrats campaigned for what they called a real referendum, and that is an in-out referendum on principle, and they criticised both my party, the Labour Party, and they criticised the Conservatives for not going far enough in agreeing with them. And I have a copy of that leaflet with me today. And it has a petition, sign our petition today from the Liberal Democrats. It's time